Have you ever noticed how our society has a strange relationship with failure? On the one hand, we celebrate stories of people who failed until they made it. On the other hand, we do everything to avoid failing ourselves. We talk about failure as if it were a necessary ingredient of success, but only when we are looking in the rearview mirror of the lives of others. For years, I lived in terror of failure, not only because of the failure itself, but because of the possibility of failure. This paralysis kept me stuck in a safe zone of mediocrity, where I did only what I was sure I could do well, until life presented me with a lesson that changed everything. It wasn't when I finally managed to avoid failure that I found success. That's when I stopped fighting him and learned to dance with him. Today, I want to share with you the most liberating discovery of my journey. How accepting failure, not as an unwanted outcome to be avoided, but as a wise master to be embraced, led me to a kind of success I could never have imagined when I was trying to be perfect. For a long time, my definition of success was simple: never fail, or at least never fail publicly. I had built a carefully curated identity based on competence, reliability, the ability to always deliver predictable results. This strategy worked well, to a certain extent. I was able to maintain a solid reputation, avoid embarrassment, maintain an image of a person who had everything under control. But there was a hidden cost in this apparent efficiency. I had stopped growing, because real growth always involves risk, and risk always includes the possibility of failure. When you commit to never failing, you automatically commit to never trying anything that might truly challenge. My comfort zone had become a golden prison. I was competent at what I did, but I was also completely stagnant. I did the same kinds of projects, I made the same kinds of decisions, I had the same kinds of relationships. Everything is safe, everything is predictable, everything is deeply unsatisfactory. The problem with comfort zones is that they are like still water. They appear calm and serene on the surface, but over time they become stagnant, lifeless, motionless. I was dying of thirst in a puddle of water that I had created myself to protect myself. But getting out of the comfort zone meant accepting the possibility of failure. And failure, in my mind, was the worst thing that could happen. Life has an interesting way of presenting us with exactly the lessons we need most, even when, especially when, we don't want to learn them. For me, that lesson came through a project I had meticulously planned, an endeavor that was supposed to be my big professional leap. I had done all the market studies, consulted all the experts, created all the contingency plans. On paper, it was impossible to fail. In practice, this is exactly what happened. The project didn't just fail. It failed spectacularly, publicly, in a way that I couldn't hide or rationalize. For the first time in my adult life, I was face to face with an undeniable failure. There was no way to reframe the narrative. There was no way to blame external circumstances. There was no way to pretend it had been a learning success. I had failed, period. The first few days after the failure were devastating, not just for the practical impact, financial, professional, but for the impact on my identity. If I wasn't the person who could always deliver results, then who was I? It was a moment of profound deconstruction. All the stories I had created about myself, all the carefully constructed images, all the protective mechanisms I had developed, all collapsed at once. But in the midst of that cave-in, something unexpected happened. For the first time in years, I felt human, vulnerable, yes, hurt, certainly, but also real in a way that I had forgotten was possible. Failure had forced me into brutal honesty with myself. I could no longer pretend that I was invincible, that I had everything under control, that I was different from other people who face difficulties and uncertainties. And in that enforced vulnerability, I discovered something surprising. People connected with me in a much deeper way when I was imperfect than when I was trying to be perfect. My attempt at failure elicited more empathy, understanding, and genuine support than all my previous successes combined. It was as if, by revealing my humanity, I had given permission for others to reveal theirs as well. Superficial conversations turned into deep dialogue. Image-based relationships have become authenticity-based connections. As the days passed and the initial shock subsided, I began to examine the wreckage of my failed project not with self-pity but with genuine curiosity. What exactly had gone wrong? What assumptions had he assumed incorrectly? What signs had he ignored? This analysis revealed insight that you would never have discovered if the project had been successful. Understandings of the market that no previous research had captured. Truths about my own behavior and tendency that constant success had masked. Lessons about leadership, communication, and decision-making that only appeared when everything went wrong. Failure had become my most rigorous and, paradoxically, most generous teacher. Strict because he didn't let me get away with excuses or self-deception. Generous because it offered me lessons that I would never be able to access through success. The transformative moment came when I stopped resisting failure and began to accept it, not just as an inevitable reality, but as a valuable part of the human experience, like cruel but necessary feedback on what was and wasn't working in my approach. This acceptance brought me a freedom that I didn't know existed. The freedom to try things I wasn't sure I could do well. The freedom to express ideas that could be misunderstood. The freedom to take risks that might not work. Because, for the first time, I knew I could survive failure. More than that, I knew I could grow with it. One of the most important distinctions I learned was between failing and being a failure. Failure is something you do. Being a failure is something you are. The first is temporary and specific. The second is permanent and total. For years, I had confused these two things. I believed that if I failed at something, it would say something fundamental about my worth as a person. That a bad result meant I was bad. That an unsuccessful project made me an unsuccessful person. But failure taught me that this equation was completely wrong. I could fail in 1,000 projects and still be a valuable person, capable, worthy of love and respect. Failure was an event, not an identity. One surprising finding was that, after surviving my first major failure, I became much braver. Not because I had developed a tolerance for suffering, but because I had discovered that failure was not the terrible monster I had imagined. Was it uncomfortable? Yes. Was it disappointing? Certainly. Was it devastating? Momentarily. But it was also educational, humanizing, and even in a broader perspective, liberating. This newfound courage allowed me to take risks that had previously paralyzed me, starting projects even without being sure of the outcome, expressing opinions even though they know they could be controversial, trying new paths even without guarantees of success. I discovered something paradoxical. The more I accepted the possibility of failure, the less I actually failed. Not because I had developed magical abilities, but because the absence of fear of failure allowed me to think more clearly, act more authentically, and make decisions based on possibilities, not fear. When you're not constantly calculating how to avoid failure, you're able to focus your energy on how to create success. When he is not paralyzed by the possibility of going wrong, he can move fluidly towards what can go right. Another important revelation was to realize that all real innovation is born from the willingness to fail. The most transformative ideas, the most impactful projects, the most creative solutions, all emerge when someone is willing to try something that may not work. Companies that changed the world were founded by people who were willing to fail. Artists who touched hearts created works that could have been completely rejected. Leaders who transformed societies made decisions that could have ended in disaster. Extraordinary success is not a result of the ability to avoid failure. It is a result of the ability to fail smartly, learn quickly, and try again more wisely. One of the most practical advantages of accepting failure was the speed with which I began to learn and evolve. When you're not afraid to make mistakes, you can test ideas quickly, receive honest feedback, and adjust your approach in real time. Instead of spending months meticulously planning to avoid any possibility of error, I started quickly implementing imperfect versions of my ideas, observing what happened, and iterating based on the actual results. This approach, which I now recognize as similar to the methodology of startups and rapid prototyping, allowed me to learn in weeks what previously took months or years to discover. One of the most beautiful consequences of accepting my own failure was how it transformed my relationship. When I stopped trying to maintain a facade of perfection, people began to relate to me in a much more genuine way. Friends began to share their own struggles and failure, creating connections based on shared humanity rather than one-sided admiration. Colleagues began to come to me for honest conversations about challenges, knowing that I wouldn't judge them for not having everything under control. My own ability to give support and guidance improved dramatically because I was no longer speaking from a position of theoretical superiority, but from a position of lived experience. Each subsequent failure, because, yes, they kept happening, became easier to process and overcome. Not because they hurt less, but because I had developed emotional and psychological tools to deal with them constructively. I've learned to ask the right question after a failure. Not, why did this happen to me? But what can this teach me? Not, how can I prevent this from happening again? But how can I use this experience to grow? This shift in perspective transformed failures of traumatic events into educational experience, from devastating endings to promising beginnings. Perhaps the most profound transformation was in my definition of success. I stopped measuring success only by external results: money earned, recognition received, goals achieved. I started to include internal metrics: courage demonstrated, authenticity maintained, learning acquired. Under this new definition, some of my greatest successes were times when I had failed externally but grown internally. Projects that didn't work out but taught me valuable lessons. Risks that did not pay for themselves but made me more courageous. Attempts that failed but connected me more deeply with my humanity. The ironic thing is that when I stopped being so afraid of failure, I started to have a lot more success, including the traditional, external, measurable success that I had always sought. But now that success was coming from a different place. Rather than coming from careful avoidance of risk, it came from intelligent navigation through. Instead of coming from maintaining a perfect image, it came from the authentic expression of my imperfect truth. Instead of coming from the guarantee of predictable results, it came from the courageous exploration of unknown possibility. Accepting my own failure has made me infinitely more compassionate about the failures of others. When you have experienced the vulnerability of failing, it is impossible to judge others who are going through the same experience. It made me a better leader, a better friend, a better human being, because I understood in a visceral way that we're all doing the best we can with the information and resources that we have. And that failure doesn't make us any less worthy of support, it makes us more in need of it. I've found that some of my most creative and innovative projects were born directly out of previous failure. Ideas that emerged from the wreckage of plans that didn't work. Solutions that appeared when I was trying to solve problems created by my own mistake. Failure had become not just a teacher, but a creative collaborator, an unexpected source of inspiration and innovation. Perhaps the most unexpected gift of accepting failure was a lightness I hadn't felt in years. The lightness of not having to carry the impossible weight of constant perfection. The lightness of being able to laugh at my own mistakes. The lightness of being human without apologizing. That lightness wasn't irresponsible. I still struggled to do a good job. I still cared about results. I still had ambitions and goals. But now all of this came from a place of joy and curiosity, not fear and control. Over time, I developed what I call the practical wisdom of failure, the ability to fail intelligently and productively. This included fail small and fast instead of big and slow. Draw specific lessons from each failure instead of just suffering from them. Share failures in ways that could help others. Use failures as data for future decisions, not as reasons to give up. Celebrate the courage to try, regardless of the outcome. The most transformative lesson that failure taught me was this: you don't have to be perfect to be valuable. You don't have to get it right every time to deserve success. You don't have to avoid failure to live an extraordinary life. In fact, it's quite the opposite. A truly extraordinary life, a life of growth, impact, authenticity, and meaning, is only possible when you accept that failure is an integral part of the human experience. When you stop fighting this reality and learn to dance with it. Failure is not the opposite of success, it is the path to. It's not something you need to avoid, it's something you need to embrace intelligently. It's not evidence that you're not good enough, it's proof that you're brave enough to try. Today, I invite you to reconsider your relationship with failure. Instead of seeing him as an enemy to be avoided, consider seeing him as a strict but generous mentor. Instead of measuring your worth by the absence of failures, measure it by the presence of courage. Allow yourself to try things that you're not sure you're going to get. Allow yourself to express ideas that may be misunderstood. Allow yourself to take risks that may not work out. Allow yourself to be imperfect while striving for excellence. And when, not if, but when you fail, remember to ask the right question. What can this teach me? How can I grow from this experience? How can this failure prepare me for future successes that I can't even imagine yet? The success you're looking for isn't on the other side of perfection. It is on the other side of the courage to be imperfect. It is not in the guarantee that everything will work out. It is in the confidence that, even when things go wrong, you will be able to transform this experience into wisdom, growth, and strength. Accepting failure is not giving up on success. It's discovering a path to success that's truer, more sustainable, and infinitely more human. What about you? What failure have you avoided facing? What risk do you not take for fear of failure? What attempt have you put off because you have no guarantee of success? Share in the comments. What is the failure that could be blocking your greatest success? If this reflection touched something in you, Leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Every day we explore paths to a more courageous, authentic, and successful life. See you in the next video. And remember, you are allowed to fail. You are allowed to be imperfect. You're allowed to try even without guarantees, because that's where the magic of life lies.